wanted to talk about, first of all, who I am, right? Now, some of you know me, you follow me on social media or whatever, but so, I'm from a really small town in Ohio originally. I got interested in communism on my own. No one in my family was a communist. I never, I know people that grew up and their parents were in the Communist Party or in SDS or something. That's not my background at all. I got interested in communism on my own. Got interested in it, started looking for communist groups. When I was in college, I ended up, I was looking around at one group, and I ended up with one particular group that I was with for about 8 years. And, I was with that group during the rise of President Barack Obama. He got elected. I ended up moving to New York City around the time of the Occupy Wall Street protests in 2011. It was a few months beforehand, but I was in New York City, and one thing that really kind of had an impact on me was the Libyan War, because this party I was with, to their credit, consistently anti-imperialist. They opposed any U.S. imperialist operation. They never supported any military interventions. And at the time, I was very opposed to the bombing of Libya. And what also bothered me as an Occupy Wall Street activist was that the Libyan revolution was being framed as if it was part of the Occupy protest movement. And I knew that this was the USA trying to tear down an independent country. And so I went and I studied the Green Book. Folks ever heard of the Green Book? That's Gaddafi's manifesto. And I read it, and I read it, and I looked into Libya's constitution and legal system. And I said, Libya is a socialist country, right? In fact, I would say that its model is closer to really existing socialism in Libya than China is. My party maintained that China was a socialist country. But yet, when I would approach the people in my party about Libya, they said, Libya is a bourgeois nationalist regime. And I said, why? And they would proceed to explain to me that in socialism, the workers control the means of production. And I would say, yeah, but I think in Libya, where they have these popular assemblies, and they'd say, yeah, but they don't. That's just propaganda from Gaddafi. And I would say, but can you show me the economic difference between Gaddafi's Libya and socialist Cuba or China? Well, no. And it really, the more I pressed them, the more I realized they didn't really know. And on top of that, the answer they gave really boiled down to Fidel Castro calls himself a Marxist-Leninist. The Chinese Communist Party call themselves Marxist-Leninists. Gaddafi calls himself an Islamic socialist. He hasn't said the right magic words, I'm a Marxist-Leninist. Therefore, Libya is a capitalist country, and China and Cuba are socialist countries. And I couldn't accept that, because that's not Marxism, right? Reality is not defined by people having ideas in their head. It's defined by material economic realities. And the economic reality of Libya, a country where the major means of production are controlled by the state, it's a planned economy, you have these like little Soviet things they call popular committees. Libya was a socialist country as far as I could tell. They couldn't give me really an answer about it. And what was weird is I had come to this conclusion totally on my own, right? Factionalism is not permitted in socialist groups. They tend to be very strict about that. But as my life continued, I met people in the younger people, my age, in the Michigan wing of my party who felt this way. And I met people here in New York who were not in the party I was in, but they also had come to similar conclusions. And I discovered that among the younger people, we all kind of had the same question. What's going on here? And I'll never forget the day I was in Zuccotti Park, the day that Gaddafi was killed. Right? I was in the Occupy Wall Street Park in 2011, the day that Gaddafi was killed. And there was a Trotskyite group there selling their newspaper, and there were some anarchist groups there. And they all were indifferent. And their attitude was, well, Gaddafi was a brutal bourgeois nationalist dictator, he was a tyrant, well, he deserved it, he oppressed people, he was sexist or homophobic. But what I thought was weird was there was a lot of people in that park who were not Marxists and not socialists, but they were just kind of working class young people who bust in. Some of them were like fans of Alex Jones, some of them were libertarians. And they all said what you just said, about Gaddafi is trying to fight for an African bank, and he's trying to create an independent currency. And I thought, this is weird. Why do I have more in common with non-Marxists than with the Marxist movement? And that pointed me to realize that there was something wrong with the organized political left. And there was something wrong with that family tree. The First International and the Second International and the Trotsky, and every communist group can trace its origins back to a split from a split from a split. And it made me realize there was something wrong with that. And eventually my journalism career began to expand. I started traveling around the world and speaking at international conferences, and I'm no longer with that political organization I was with. But I've come to the conclusion that socialism is not a religion. Socialism is a tool. During the 20th century, socialism was a tool that countries that were kept in chronic poverty by imperialism utilized to industrialize and raise their people out of poverty. And that now in the area of accumulation through destruction, we need to start talking to the people of the United States about utilizing socialism to get out of the crisis that we're in. I see socialism as a tool, not as an ideology, not as a religion, not as a faith, but as a tool. And that it's a tool that people in the United States should be engaged about using to get out of the crisis. And I noticed one thing I wanted to add is, during the time of feudalism, a lot of the way that the bourgeoisie organized to bring down feudalism was they had secret societies. Masons and the Illuminati and the Knights Templar, and these were like secret societies. And, if you talk about Freemasonry, what do the Freemasons believe? Well, it's all on the internet now, but you're not supposed to know it, right? It's like you're supposed to join and pay them lots of money, and after 2 or 3 years they tell you a little bit more, and then after 2 or 3 years they tell you a little bit more. And then finally you find out what they believe. It's kind of like the Church of Scientology. It's a very similar model, right? You join Scientology, it's just supposed to be like some kind of weird therapy, self-help, and after you've been in for 20 years and pay enough money, they tell you all about the space alien. And that the way communist groups are organized, more or less, the way they're intended to function, is a lot like Freemasonry or the Church of Scientology. The way the group I was in functioned, it was assumed that average people would never be convinced of communism. So the idea was we would form an organization that was protesting against the war. Or we'd find an organization that was protesting against police brutality. And we would organize protests around it. And then we would kind of whisper to people, there's this group that we're part of that can tell you what things are really about. And we pick the best, and then they would join. And it was bizarre, because in the age of information technology, all these people knew exactly what we believed. They'd read our Wikipedia page, so it was pretty silly. But it was that Masonic style, right? We're not going to tell you what we really believe. And, the main critique that most people that were familiar with the organization I was in was that the group defended North Korea. And there was this assumption that if we just protested enough with these people, they would come to like us and be our friends, and then eventually we could get them into a group that supported North Korea. And the response of these people was generally, I don't agree with you about North Korea. And again, it's kind of like this Masonic Scientology way of organizing. It's if you suck somebody in and they've paid money over years, and you finally tell them something after years and years, and it's become their whole social circle, and you finally get to that point, they'll believe anything. You know what I'm saying? Like that's the whole thing. It's not a persuasive argument, right? And I think that this way of organizing, on the assumption that average people can't be convinced, right? That it has to be done in this very clandestine way. It almost reminds you of like Tom Sawyer, right? Communist groups, they all have their fake name. I can't tell you my real name. My real name is Joe Stevenson, or and then you almost expect them to like pull out decoder rings, or it's almost kind of silly the way that they're organizing. And at the same time, it's all based on this assumption that average people can't be convinced of socialism. And the truth is, have you looked at the polls that are coming out? Have you looked at the rise of Bernie Sanders? Average people can be convinced of socialism. And this Freemason model of organizing that was very effective in Tsarist Russia in 1913, it was very effective for the feudal, fighting against feudalism for the early bourgeoisie at a time where you could be burned at the stake for believing that the earth was not the center of the universe. That was a very effective way of doing things. But now, we live in an era of information technology where information is so widely available. If anything, now necessitates socialist agitation more than ever. I wanted to add also that I came across the writings of a very brilliant man who died a couple of years ago named Nelson Peary. And he was a leader he was in the Communist Party. Eventually he had an organization. He was a Maoist with the Communist Labor Party. I'm not going to endorse his organization, but he wrote a very beautiful book called The Future is Up to Us. And in that book, he critiques Marxism, and he makes two very interesting points. So when we talk about the historical narrative of, hunter-gatherer civilization, slavery, feudalism, capitalism leading to socialism, he points out that feudalism wasn't brought down by the peasants rising up. It wasn't, right? The peasants did rise up all throughout feudalism. There were many peasant revolts. There were in Germany and Britain, all kinds of places. That never led to the overthrow of feudalism. Feudalism was not overthrown by peasants. It was overthrown by the mercantile classes. And they were not part of feudalism. Right? And it was them who overthrew it, a class that was not part of the feudal system. And why were they able to actually overthrow feudalism? All these peasant revolts that happened they would maybe seize power for 100 years, and then the feudal system would take it over, right? The peasants would seize power, and they'd hold power for a little while longer. They'd reorganize the peasant communes in a more egalitarian way, but then eventually feudalism would retake them because they had the same mode of production, right? But the reason the mercantile class was able to overthrow feudalism is because they represented a higher mode of production. They were not the feudal mode of production reorganized in a different way. They were a different mode of production. It was capitalism. It was production for profit. It was global trade, overturning feudalism. The Soviet Union had the same mode of production as the capitalist world, just organized differently. They had steel mills that were the same as American steel mills. They had textile factories that were the same as British textile factories. They just organized them in a state central plan, but it was still the same mode of production. It's the same mode of production organized differently. And so then he argues in his book that the overturn of capitalism requires a new mode of production. That it would have to be a new mode of production to defeat the old mode of production. He talks about a revolution happening in 3 stages. He says first there's an economic revolution with a new mode of production. Next there's a social revolution of a new class that comes into existence to go with that new mode of production. And then third you have a political revolution where that new class seizes power. And that's how revolutions tend to happen. And then that points to the computer revolution. Karl Marx talks about workers being reduced to being appendages of machines. Under feudalism, they're skilled craftsmen, they're carving wood in their own way, they're doing art and it has this spiritual character, but under capitalism, they're just appendages to machines, working the assembly line, churning things out. But now, at this point, with artificial intelligence, we're getting machines with very, very, very few appendages. Jack Ma talks about how we used to work really hard to make people like machines, but now we have machines that are like people, right? And that we're at the point where any role of people in production is increasingly being reduced. And we're also at the point where we see people making profits from corporations not with their labor. Facebook is a great example. If you get on Facebook, right, you post, hey, I was just at Caleb's class, it was awesome, he blew my mind. You're making money for Mark Zuckerberg by doing that. But you're not working. You're having a good time, right? And that there are all these ways in which people are generating wealth in ways that is not selling their labor power. And that we have a new mode of production. And as I said before, self-driving cars would be a very, very good thing in a socialist society. Less work for everybody. But in capitalism, it leaves people without. It leaves people... And the necessity for people coming together and seizing control of the means of production and forcing these high-tech machines that don't have appendages or have very few appendages, the necessity for that is growing. And then people talk about the new class of workers whose ability to sell their labor is drastically reduced, right? How many assembly line factory workers are there these days, right? And increasingly, there's not a role for millions of people in the means of production. And I think this all points toward the way out and the problem that we're in. And I also want to emphasize, and I've emphasized many times, the importance of a pamphlet that Karl Marx wrote called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And he talks about how France in 1851 was in the middle of a crisis, and wages were dropping, and people were suffering, and the workers were rising up, and there were revolts and protests. And so Louis Bonaparte, who was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, seized power and created an authoritarian military dictatorship. And he seized power on behalf of one section of the capitalists. And what he did was he used the state to suppress another section. He was for the finance capitalists and the farmers against the factory owners. So one section of the ruling class seizes control of the government and then uses the state to suppress other capitalists in the hope of restoring order. He actually called his military junta the Party of Order, right? And that happens when the rate of profit is dropping, when the capitalists are not making profits, when there's instability in society, when there's uprisings and protests. One section of the capitalist class violently seizes power and tries to violently seize control of the state in order to end the crisis. But of course, the other sections of the ruling class don't want that, because it's that, you know, every capitalist wants the crisis to go away. They just want the other capitalists to be the ones that have to pay for it. And so divisions within the ruling class are becoming more and more of a reality. And in the past, in the lead up to World War I and World War II, these divisions played out as countries divided. But I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing capitalists that are not loyal to each other. They're interplaying. For example, like the Obama administration seemed very tied in with Europe. The Trump administration seems very opposed to an alliance with Europe. However, you'll notice there are capitalists in Europe that are very friendly to Trump. The pro-Brexit wing of British capital was very friendly to Trump. Right? The new right of Europe seems very friendly to Trump. The Obama wing of American capital seems more friendly to the liberals and moderates in Europe. And we're seeing alliances of capitalists developing all across the capitalist world, and these alliances are not on the basis of nation state. It's not the entire American capitalist ruling class is not behind the U.S. government and its policies. And that there are divisions between capitalists, but they're not playing out on a national level. Just like we're seeing China's One Belt, One Road initiative. And we're seeing that it's making inroads in countries not specific to the country. There are sections of Nigeria that are loyal to China and part of this One Belt, One Road initiative. There are also big sections of Nigeria that are with the United States. And the nation state as the deciding factor is not exactly clear. So we're in a period where it seems like the capitalists are fighting amongst themselves, but the people are also suffering immensely and trying to organize and trying to figure out a way out of this. And what happens when you have Bonapartism is the ruling class, sections of it, begin recruiting workers as their foot soldiers to beat down other workers and to beat down other sections of the ruling class. And that tends to be how it's done. And if you'll look at all the revolutions of history, they started out this way. The Russian Revolution began as the ruling class, the capitalists of Russia, deposing the Tsar because he was losing the war. And then it turned into a fight between the capitalists of Russia that were tied in with Germany and wanted to end World War I, that were aligned with the Bolsheviks, and the capitalists of Russia that wanted to continue the war and were tied in with American capital. It was a fight among the ruling capitalist class, a Bonapartist struggle that then led to the working class taking power. And what happened in China, the Chinese Revolution played out that way. The Cuban Revolution played out that way. Bolivarianism very much played out that way. These fights among the ruling class lay the basis for the working class getting involved in the political process. And I think that that's underestimated. People want to make it, they have a glorious kind of propaganda narrative of the revolutions, that one day the people just couldn't take it anymore and they went out in the street. That's propaganda. I'm paying close attention to Scottish independence right now. So Scottish independence, it seems weird. It's like, and Scottish independence has been around for decades, right? It's just this weird, vague, cultural nationalist movement, right? But Scottish independence has stopped being that. Suddenly it's become an economic issue. It's about the oil and gas in the North Sea, right? The oil and gas that's largely owned by BP, London bankers. At this point, the Scottish independence movement is demanding that oil and gas be nationalized. And the Scottish independence movement has focused on austerity and cuts in social spending. And it's basically turned into a movement where you could say that a lot of wealthy capitalists in Scotland who are losing profits would like to get a subsidy from that North Sea oil and gas. And so they're mobilizing and they're aligning with the working class that doesn't want cuts in the National Health Service and doesn't want cuts in education. They're aligning with them to fight against the London ruling class and BP over access to this North Sea oil. And we're seeing a Bonapartist struggle pushing the working class into motion. And it's working class people and it's trade unions that are fighting for Scottish independence and demanding that the Labour Party be more left-wing. This kind of thing is happening. This is the reality of what we're seeing. And of course, as sections of the ruling class fight with each other, they're going to be violent to other sections. And they're going to, the kind of consensus. And, Ronald Reagan used to say, we're all friends after 6. They're not all friends after 6 anymore. You can tell that. And they're going to use government repression to try and control not only the working class resisting, but also to control each other. Right? When Donald Trump said during the election he was going to jail Hillary Clinton, right? This faction around Kamala Harris seems very, very committed to international wars, and it seems to be kind of the forces that were in Hillary Clinton's State Department trying to seize the White House once again. The fact that when Bernie Sanders was speaking at a recent DNC meeting, they all walked out as he was speaking, basically making clear they wouldn't support him in a general election. This is all divisions within the ruling class that are playing out. But when these divisions within the ruling class happen, it creates an opening. And I think what really needs to be inserted into the consciousness of the people of the United States is the notion that the government is best, that governs least, that, hey, we should just privatize everything. That needs to be gotten rid of. We need to introduce the notion that having a government that fights for the people, that works to raise living standards, is something that is completely acceptable. I've raised the slogan before, we need a government of action to fight for working families. But a government of action, a government that will get things done, a government that is dramatic, right? And you can imagine some kind of Bonapartist faction in the United States wanting to help working people and pushing working people into motion to combat other sections. And you can imagine that leading to something exciting in the United States. I mean, this is all hypothetical. I'm just talking off the top of my head. You can imagine it. But at the same time, we need to hold on to the principles of scientific socialism.